Hi, everyone. It's about 7 o'clock, give or take. Yeah. So we'll get started. Good evening. My name is Derek Misho. I'm the coordinator of Judaic Studies here at the University of Maine. For those of you who don't know, Judaic Studies is an interdisciplinary minor. It's an academic program here at the university that exists through the generosity and vision of Norman Minsky and the support of folks in the greater Bangor community for the most part. So I'd just like to welcome you all to this public reading and talk this evening, presented by the Judaic Studies program and in partnership with Congregation Beth Israel and the Jewish Community Endowment Association. The University of Maine recognizes that it is located on Marsh Island in the homeland of the Penobscot Nation. The issues of water, territorial rights, and encroachment upon sacred sites are ongoing. The Penobscot Nation is connected to the other Wabanaki tribal nations, the Passamaquoddy, the Maliseet, and the Micmac through kinship, alliances, and diplomacy. The university also recognizes that the Penobscot Nation and other Wabanaki tribal nations are distinct, sovereign, legal, and political entities with their own powers of self-governance and self-determination. Something to keep in mind as we gather here today on the traditional homeland of the Penobscot people. So this evening, our talk will run for 45 minutes, 45 to 50 minutes, a short hour, followed by a few moments for a question and answer. Folks who are on Zoom, you can put your questions in the chat to me, and I'll try to get as many of those addressed as possible. At the conclusion of the event, we'll have a reception in the back of the room. Unfortunately, we have not the technology to send that through Zoom. And with that, I'd like to introduce Rabbi William Seamers of Congregation Beth Israel and a lecturer in Judaic Studies here at the University of Maine, who will now introduce our speaker for the evening.
Thank you, Derek. It's been an honor of mine to be affiliated with the Judaic Studies of UMaine for the past 8 years since I've been here. I want to recognize, too, our friend Norman Minsky, whose vision and support, his generosity has made all of this possible with the gifts of so many other people. We've had several great directors of the program since I've been here, but I want to embarrass and recognize Derek mentioned a little bit. He's been here for 3 years. And in those 3 years, the program has grown greatly. Our outreach to the community has increased. And he's been an essential part of elevating the conversations and the prestige of the program on campus. And for that, all of us are very grateful, as we are grateful for the support of all of you. The Torah saves poetry for the very end. Shortly before Moshe dies, he's given the instruction, Kitvu et hashirah hazot, write this song. And we're given a little poem at the end, a song to take us out, some music to go home with. But because in the same breath that the Torah says, Kitvu et hashirah hazot, it also says, Kitvu et haTorah hazot. Write this song, write this poem, write this Torah, teaching that perhaps the Torah itself is to be understood as one long poem. And though we treasure it and we turn to it for instruction, we remember that beyond the abstract, through the meaning, the Torah is a collection of sentences, a collection of fragments, words, letters, and shapes. And to meditate upon the language and to play with the words has always been an essential rabbinic vocation. It's not an accident that we have great rabbis who are also the great poets of our tradition, people like Moshe Ibn Ezra and Yehuda Halevi. That poetry, properly understood, is at the very center of Torah, properly understood. We are honored tonight to welcome a wonderful poet. Stuart Kestenbaum is the author of 6 published collections of poetry, as well as poetry published in many other periodicals and publications. He is a broadcaster and a teacher, having served as the director of the Haystack Mountain School on Deer Island for 25 years. He is a former, it says former Poet Laureate of Maine. I mean, for my money, once a laureate, always a laureate. But he is a fixture of the Maine artistic community, and he is relentless in his passion to bring the wonders of poetry, the wonders of art, and the wonders of words to our state and to the world. Please join me in welcoming Stuart Kestenbaum.
Through I believe it's an appropriate sleight of hand, if somebody is eating, they can take their mask off. And I consider drinking water to be eating. It feels almost rabbinic, don't you think? So therefore, I'll be drinking water while I'm reading as if I were eating the whole time, so I won't have my mask on. I'm pretty far away from everybody, and from you on Zoom, I'm so far away, nothing to worry about. Well, I've given many readings, but when Derek called and said, would you speak to the Judaic Studies program and reference those parts of your work that are draw from Jewish traditions and liturgy. I thought I had never framed my work in that way, and when I did, I realized that I have so many works that are influenced by my background, my upbringing, my experiences with congregations both in Bangor and Portland, that all those notions are really in so much of the work, it surprised me. So before I start to read, I thought I would just talk about what I see as the connections. One is, I think in my work, is the life of a child. So when you're growing up and you hear a Bible story, you transform it in your head because you know the world as you see it. So for example, growing up in New Jersey, when I heard about Noah's Ark and there was a rainbow, I thought it was oil slicks. I had never seen a rainbow. So to me, that's what God's promise was, actually an oil slick, but it was a holy thing at the same time. The other notion is that of tikkun olam, of repairing the world, that as an obligation, tenet of our religion is that we have an obligation to do what we can to make the world better in whatever way that we can, and I think that's infused in the work as well. And then this notion that we speak of on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur of teshuvah, of returning or turning, and that's in so many of my poems, because I think there's a way that maybe in every poem you're making some sort of gesture that moves you towards another thing. As I understand it within my Judaic disclaimer at the beginning, that what I'm saying is all things that I know, and having a rabbi in the audience, I'm slightly hesitant to go too far, but I would say the notion of teshuvah is, even if you make that gesture, the turning is in making the gesture, and actually saying you're going to do it and turning to make that's the start. It's not enough, but it's it at the same time, that you're willing to do that. And I think in terms of trying my spiritual sense of the world, trying to understand it, I think that's in so many of the poems. And another one is apprehending holiness in the everyday. So by holiness, to me, as a writer, that means anything that stops time in a way, that makes you pay attention, that you takes your breath away in a sense, that you see that it's right there. There's a rabbi, deceased, Aryeh Kaplan, who writes a lot about Jewish mysticism, and he had a book on Jewish meditation. And one of the things he said is, one meditation is to wash each dish as if God were coming to dinner. And when I empty the dishwasher has helped me with my work, but I think about that in the morning, like it's like saying, pay attention, pay attention right now, not later, not when you have the time to pay attention right now, which is not specifically Judaic, but I think that's part of that tradition too. And then also thinking of Martin Buber and his notion of being in relationship. So a thing's not an it. When you're in relationship, it's you're saying you to the person, to the situation, to the world. It's another way of paying attention. But that's all, I realize that's all colored through who I was, who I've been. And I was thinking, today I drove from Deer Isle to Monson, which is like 2.5 hours away, because I had a meeting there. It was great because I drove through a rain, sleet, snow, and then back through the same thing again, only more of it. And I was remembering when I first took the job at Haystack and moved to Deer Isle, I was thinking, there are no Jews here. I felt like I was missing, and I hadn't discovered that I could drive to Bangor, which is an hour, 15 minutes away. And I was in an office in Deer Isle Village, very small place above the post office, is where the Haystack office used to be. And I went across the street to get a lunch at the grocery store that used to be there. And I saw a Hasidic Jew walking across the street, and it was spitting snow. It could have been Poland in 1935. And I thought, I'm having a vision. I'm actually having a vision. And I felt like I couldn't go into the post office and say, excuse me, did you just see a Hasidic Jew walking? Came from here? Because I felt like I'm too new to the town. It felt a little odd. But I felt like it was some sort of sign. It's a sign. It's okay. It's okay to be here. I later found out he had a summer home in Brooklyn, Maine, across the bridge, and he was having some work done in his house. But I thought it's kind of a sign. So all of which is to say that I perhaps have a Judaic sensibility with a Maine nuance, I think. So I think both those feature into the work. And also, whenever the Torah is put back into the Ark and we sing Eitz Chaim, I get chills, and I realize it's because I'm connected in some way that I can't explain to something that's longer than I know, that's deeper. And I think both in a religious ceremony and in poetry, what's happening is you're connecting yourself to something that's deeper, something you didn't know. You're never going to know it completely. Either you're going to try to get at it, and words are a way to try to get at something. You're always trying to get there. And the last lines of before the Torah goes in the Ark, when it says, help us return to you and we shall return, renew our lives as in days of old. I feel like that's what I try to put in my poems. Although I would never say that to anybody, and I just said it now. So I'm going to read poems, and I think you may see those connections in these poems, and I'll reference them too. This first poem is called. Oh, one other thing I want to say is when I was poet laureate, my term ended last March. One time I was asked to speak to the state legislature. Every session, they have a member of the clergy do a benediction. And they asked me to do the benediction. And I said, I'm a poet, I'm not a member of the clergy, but they said it was okay. I got a note that said that my benediction should be short, ecumenical, and upbeat. I got a placard to put in my car. It said "Clergy of the Day," and I could park anywhere I wanted to. It's a great perk. But I said to the legislators that I was going to read them a poem. I said, but I thought that what might be common between a poem and a prayer is that they both may just slow down and pay attention. This poem is called "If Poetry is a Prayer for Looking Deeply." If poetry is a prayer for looking deeply, then each day is special, not because Macy's is having a sale on coffee pots, flatware, towels, cookware, convection ovens, and as many bras as you'd ever need, but because in the autumnal air, the late air, November 18th, the only red is in the winterberry's fragile light reflecting into the world, which today is drying out after a week of rain, and it feels like the old world is starting over again, which it is, crows flying over a newly revealed planet as it spins into the light. The eiders plummet into the blue, diving to a depth I'll never know, small bird lungs full of air. It's the deep descent into the everyday that we are after, the moment that will make tap water holy, the first breath a blessing. This is how the holy ones go throughout life, thanking God for every ritual of the body, every mouthful of food, every movement of the bowels. For what can't be holy? What can't we transform from profanity, past lowliness and terror into holiness? Today, the overflowing ponds look toward heaven, and the sky answers back with the deep blue. Amen. This next poem is a Bangor poem. And it's from a series that I did of prayers, which grew out of writing run-on sentences, kind of long sentences, which I would then edit, but so there would be kind of a flow to it. And I think the thinking was, well, what can't you make into a prayer? Everything could be a prayer with intention, I think. And this took place near Governor's Restaurant on Broadway, since if you know that. You would need to know that to understand the poem. Prayer in the strip mall, Bangor, Maine. The week after Thanksgiving, and the stores are decked out for holiday shopping, including TJ Maxx, where what was once too expensive loses its value and attracts us. There's a store with a big yellow banner proclaiming giant book sale, a seasonal operation of remaindered books, which doesn't mean that the books aren't good, only that the great machinery of merchandising didn't engage its gears in quite the right way. And I buy 2 books of poetry and I'm leaving the store, the first snowstorm of the winter on the way. And as I get to the glass double doors, a bearded man with a cane is entering. He's been walking with a woman who is continuing to another store, and he has a look that can make him either eccentrically brilliant or just plain simple. And as I open the door and he opens the other side, he turns and says, "I love you." Not to me, but calling back to his friend who is departing, only he said it looking at me, closest to me, which is unintended love, random love, love that should be spread throughout the world and shouted in our ears for free. These next few poems are ones that grew out of my understanding of religion when I was in elementary school. So we hear in Hebrew school Bible stories, and one was when Abraham, when 3 angels or messengers came to Abraham and Sarah to tell them they were going to have a child, Isaac, and Sarah laughed because she was old and it was impossible. And Yitzhak means laughter, Isaac's name. Religion. With a heavy Yiddish accent, our immigrant teacher told us stories from the Bible where I would freely integrate New Jersey and the ancient and holy desert. So when she told us 3 angels disguised as men visited Sarah and Abraham in their old age, I could see these bearers of good news going door to door, the relentless sun beating down on them, only they looked more like private eyes with trench coats or the fuller brushmen who had escaped from Germany.
Now, you know, Sarah laughed when she heard she would bear a child in old age, and I'm sure she was also laughing a little at these visitors I'd sent from another time who spoke Aramaic with an accent from Newark, just as these men were startled to find themselves talking in another language, the word of God breaking through the after-dinner silence in the tent, whose interior looked remarkably like the apartment of my grandmother, a woman who had her own stories, the oldest person I knew. And this poem is about the oil slick. It's pretty embarrassing to not have seen a rainbow, I think, but I don't think I drew them either, with my crayons. I just kind of missed it. Must be, if you missed one thing in school, if you missed a unit, you'd just be clueless about it. Like, I was sick when we learned about flax, and FLAX, and for years, it took me a long time to catch up on that one. Cotton, wool, I was good on, but flax I missed completely. When I first heard Noah's story, how God gave a sign that the earth would never be flooded again, I had never seen a rainbow. That's the title. So I love having a title that long. So when it rained hard on the New Jersey streets, when the rain made little domes as it struck the asphalt and torrents rushed down by the curbs and into the storm sewer, the rainbows appeared, the illuminated oil slicks, God's multicolored promise shone on the streets, floating on puddles, glistening on the wet blacktop. The world was new again, and water was dripping off the leaves of the sheltering maples. God was in heaven, and I was riding my bike fast through the puddles. There were no doves with olive branches, but their relatives, the pigeons, slapped their wings as they left the earth and banked gracefully in unison. And how far off was I with the rainbows? Weren't the oil slicks a kind of covenant that had traveled from the 4.6 billion-year-old sun down to the earth, growing prehistoric plants that rose again as oil empowered and lubricated the engines of Fords and Buicks? May I be forgiven for misinterpreting an old story. It was all I knew, and I was making the best of it. When I was in elementary school, I knew all about baseball. Perhaps I was an idol worshiper, I must confess, with Mickey Mantle as my idol. And I was watching a baseball game with my dad, and I said a prayer that Mickey Mantle would hit a home run, and he did. That's a lot of power when you're 11. It since has deserted me, but in that one moment. And this is called, When I Was 10, I Had a Prayer Answered. The fireflies send their yellow beacons into the humid New Jersey air as dusk surrounds each house, pushing its way through our screen windows, mingling with the blue light of the TV. In this glow, we sit watching the Yankees play the Detroit Tigers. It's an away game, so even as the sky begins to rumble, in Michigan, the lights haven't come on yet. I love Mickey Mantle with a passion. I know when he was born, what's wrong with his knees, how great he is, and how he still isn't as great as he could be. He steps up to bat as the thunder and lightning begin in our suburban sky. I send off a prayer for the Mick as Mel Allen updates his batting average. Oh dear God, let him hit a home run. He's got bad knees. He's from Oklahoma. His father is dead. Let him do well, thinking all this quickly and fervently so that it will be sent before the pitch arrives at the plate. And his bat connects and the ball sails into the stands of Tiger Stadium. How did this one small prayer find its way into heaven so quickly? How did it rocket past the prayers of children sick with malaria in the UNICEF films? The old women next to their husbands in the metallic white wards at Beth Israel Hospital, past the prayers of my next door neighbor whose mother died of cancer, past all the prayers of children in concentration camps, a forest of eyes behind unscalable fences. So many prayers they must have sent up, so many unanswered. The prayers cling to the gates of heaven like butterflies, wings trembling in the celestial breeze made every time a soul breaks free. What was God thinking to let mine in and leave the other ones at the gate? A home run, that's an easy one, let the kid have it. and the uncountable prayers on the way up, fighting through the thick air. So many, it sounds like a swarm of bees in spring, a desperate hum of hope. Mickey circles the bases on his bum knees. Outside, the thunder rolls and the rain begins, raining hard, pounding on windows in the shining black street. I think, part of that happened, and then part of it didn't happen, but because I wrote it, it happened, which is how language works. You can see it's at its most insidious with dictators, who use language and characterize things in a certain way, or demagogues who do that. And I think, but when it's used, it can also elevate us, or it has the ability to transform how we're looking at a thing. So when poetry uses metaphor, or when there's metaphor in the Torah, you can be, it may not have happened, but it happened because you say it. And it can transform how you look at things. So I'm not sure that Jacob had an actual ladder came down from heaven, but I can see it in my mind's eye, and it changes how I think about. If you just said, "Oh, yeah, somebody had a divine experience," is not the same as making the specificity of a thing that grounds you in how you look at it. A thing I learned through living is, and I'm still learning, is about dying. And I would think when my father died, when I was in my mid-30s, it was my first adult experience with grief. And I was so moved by the Jewish traditions of mourning, which are so directed toward what steps you need to take to not move through it, because you're always moving in it, around it. You never through it, I don't think, but it gives you a framework, and helps you understand that. And this poem is about my father's death, but also our son being born at a year or so earlier than that. It's called Tethered. Getting ready for work, my father hawked up phlegm from the last night's cigarettes, and I felt I would gag with him. He threaded his belt through gray work pants, not looking back as his hand felt its way behind his back. He looked forward, head slightly bowed, eyes fixed on the floor. What was he thinking? Another day, my legs ache. Another day, it's cold. In this moment between dreams and day, his belt was like a tether holding him here. Maybe he thinks of his father on the way to the junkyard. Maybe he is a young boy in prayer shawl and knickers, all the world before him. Now I am somewhere between the worlds of father and son when I thread my belt. I think of my second son as he emerged from the birth canal, the milky blue cord wrapped around his neck. Turning one way, his lifeline would have choked him, but the doctor lifted and unwound it, cut it, and he has arrived. We wiped the blood and amniotic fluid off his body, and it was his first day in this world of work, trash in the streets, stockbrokers, sunlight, and shadow. And my father, now no longer tethered to this world, how his soul leaving his body must have paused and fluttered around his family for a moment, like the hands of a woman making the blessing over the Sabbath candles, Sabbath of light, Sabbath of peace. In some of my poems, I'm aware, in synagogue, there's a liturgy that you hear all the time. So even if you start hearing it when you're 6 or 7, it stays with you. And the high holidays, the repetition of who shall live and who shall die, who by fire and who by water, that whole grim litany of possibility and probability. It just and even the idea of the book of life. It's a big book. That's another place where metaphor moves you. And I once heard a Catholic theologian John Dominic Crozon talked about metaphor, and he was on Fresh Air with Terry Gross, and he was talking about the virgin birth and talking about it being a metaphor, and Terry Gross said, "Wait, you're a priest, are you saying it's just a metaphor? Like, I got you, you know?" And he said, "Well, I'd say it's a metaphor, but I wouldn't say it's just a metaphor, because metaphor is the most powerful thing we have. You don't need to demean it. It's what it is. It's a leap into another thing." The Book of Life. The large man with the red nose runs the red light on Forest Avenue and into my car, sending me against the window in slow motion, like a General Motors test dummy. While I rattle around my body, all around the world, this moment freezes. It's like a wildlife movie, or Bambi when a shot is fired, or a hunter walks into the woods. All the creatures stop, sensing change in the air. Chiropractors look into the distance and feel a tingling in their spines. Attorneys stop dictating and daydream out-of-court settlements. In Hartford, Connecticut, the insurance capital of the world, papers begin to materialize in a large room, each one with my name on it, spelled incorrectly, each billing me the wrong amount. Was this what was written down in the Book of Life when I woke up this morning, inscribed on one of its enormous pages? 11:03, get rammed by a Chevrolet station wagon. Is each second of my day ordained, not just who shall live and who shall die, but who shall break his watch, and who shall cut himself shaving, who shall wake up in the middle of the night thinking of all the stupid things he has said, who shall splash water on his face in the morning and wonder who he is? Or do these moments write themselves one moment at a time, rough drafts awaiting a final edit? If I had taken 10 seconds longer to start the car, I would have missed his bumper. 10 seconds here, 10 seconds there. It could be a different life. It could be someone else. You can't think that way all the time, but one of the profound rituals of Judaism is the Sabbath, of stopping time, of slowing down, of resting. But it can be a frightening thing too, because it's much easier not to slow down sometimes. Like, my phone's right here next to me, I'm just using it as a clock, but it's easy to not. It's harder in a way to do that, and this is a poem about the Sabbath. Sabbath. I want us to make this pilgrimage every week. After we have kindled the Sabbath candles, walk away from the house and stand in the back field, away from the roads, light and traffic, so that the stars become brighter and we can look at our own house for what it is, a shelter from the wilderness that surrounds us. The ancient light of the Milky Way and the steady beating of wind rattling ash and spruce, endless wind, endless night, a harmony so frightening we head back into the house pretending to be cold. Could we add a minute each time to what we can bear, so that years from now we will stand there all night in the slow circling of heaven, the dipper emptying itself, the fox and deer brushing against us as they make their rounds. This poem is a lot of metaphor. I think for me there was a place in my writing where I used to judge myself before I wrote, and I thought, well, if you can judge yourself later, but you really can't judge yourself while you're writing, because it'll stop you from doing anything. You really have to let it go first, and then reel it back if you want to, but you can't be afraid of making a gesture that you won't get to the gesture or the thought you didn't know you had, or it didn't arise if you don't let yourself go. So in this, I began to imagine myself fishing for God. That was the notion, and then the rest of it kind of followed from there. I am fishing for God. I am fishing for God, using my heart as bait. It is just before dawn. The slightest hint of pink bleeds into the night sky. I use my penknife to cut the hole in my chest, reaching behind the pocket of my shirt. What a tough muscle to pull the hook through. The heart is astonished to be in this other world and trembles and shivers like a moth discovered in daylight. I try to calm it by stroking it, by telling it that it'll all be okay, but what do I know? The breeze picks up and chills the cavern in my chest. It feels good to be empty at last. I cast my heart across the water. I cast it again and again. Sometimes it floats on the surface, other times it sinks below. Something will strike at it that I can't see. I pray I'm using the right bait. The tough outer layers soften in the water. The heart grows smaller, more pliant. It has become a beautiful blue jewel. I begin not to recognize it. Was this me? It waits, I wait. The boat rocks slightly in the breeze, lifted and lowered by the tide. I began to think a lot about angels. And actually, when we lived in a different house in Deer Isle, I'd get up early to write, and I would look at this house across the street from us, which is a Greek Revival white farmhouse, kind you see a lot of places in Maine. And it was just like kind of austere and beautiful just to see it. And then I began to think of houses and how we say house of prayer or house of thanksgiving, house of mourning. And so I began to write a series of poems that were thinking of like a house as a metaphor. And I'm going to read you two of those. I have to make sure I know what time it is, though. My phone turned itself off, so. Okay. House of Thanksgiving. In the house of Thanksgiving, I have seen the angels late at night, the incandescent lights still on downstairs. They are writing psalms with quills they pull from their wings. They toss crumpled drafts into the wood stove, and smoke rises from the chimney, still holding the shape of the words, then feathers out into a gray landscape. The soot makes a film on the shrubs. These angels sing their songs of praise until they have moved past irony into full-on love and kiss one another with passion and become like children at a family gathering, running from room to joyous room in the circle of downstairs. If I watch them all night at dawn, I see the birch branches shaking in lavender light like fine capillaries where this world flows into the next. And if I step outside my own house, I can hear them laughing and hear the heavy thud of their footsteps in prayer. And this one is called House of Prayer. You'll see in this where I draw, there's a Judaic sensibility and a Maine sensibility joined together, I would say. House of Prayer. Inside the house of prayer, the ancient ones rock slowly back and forth. They have been praying since just after time began, when the sun knew itself, rose on the first day after humans were created. Even way back then, there were fervent wishes. The path to the house is worn and rutted. Outside the barn are two silos full of prayers, a satellite dish with channels upon channels for sending and receiving. Bales of old prayers bank the foundation for winter. Over time, the broken and the restless make pilgrimages, each with their own hearts to pray for. Inside, it is nearly silent, except for the faint sound of lips moving and an occasional moan of sorrow or remembrance. And then there are the prayers that get jumbled, like leaving the right phone message on the wrong answering machine, only you don't know it and can't take it back. This is what has happened throughout time. It gives us what sympathy we have. Don't search for your own prayer with your name sewn in the back. Don't try to find the pure thought that danced from your lips. Think of the person who wanted what you've gotten. Think of healthy children, plentiful food. Think of a man in another country who can finally weep, who is watching the sunrise on the only day there is. The notion of, that I mentioned earlier, of tikkun olam, of repairing has really, I think, figured prominently in my work. And then when I was director at Haystack, I would watch people work with materials all the time, and they're always making adjustments or fixing things in one way or another. And I think, I guess it's great if it starts out perfect, but there's something that's heartening about a thing that's fixed. It's got a different kind of story, and maybe it's more resilient. This was called The Body Remembers. I slip on the rocks at low tide, floating for a timeless moment over the skeletons of shells, the fields of barnacles, until my face meets the granite and my cheek and eye grow numb and turn blue and black as my body sets about to heal the damaged tissue, the broken bone. To think all this is programmed inside me, never called on until this moment of swelling and bleeding. My body, my faithful companion, my inside out, my outside in, repairs itself while I sit on top of it like some incompetent ruler whose aides know how to take care of all the details. My body mends itself like a fisherman at his nets, like my mother-in-law darning socks. Our job on earth is to repair the broken and bruised world. We fix from within. We pull into the garage of the soul and put ourselves on the lift, take out the wrenches and grease gun and get to work. Oh, miraculous recovery for what we don't know that blesses us. This next poem is about the ritual of Tashlich, which is at Rosh Hashanah, when you cast out your sins, the things that you want to change, into a body of moving water, is the tradition. I'm looking for confirmation, that's right. But this poem is also part of a group of a book that I wrote where I had started to write poems where I asked people to send me words. They wouldn't know what I was, everybody sending them, nobody knew what the other person was sending the words. And I had friends who were physicists and artists, and they sent me words, and then I would just pick them out of a hat, and then I had to use those poems and those words in a poem. So it gave it a kind of framework. So the words I was working with were Creekside, Cobscook, which is the bay in Washington County, weight, plate, sluggard, uplifting, transmissivity, fog, entanglement, and George Clooney. What I liked about working this way is that it's easy enough to blame, I don't know, it's like, well, you got George Clooney, what are you gonna do with it? Not like it's an opportunity. It's like what you have, it's materials you have to work with. Tashlich. You might be standing at a railing overlooking the Hudson, watching tugboats at work, or creekside in the woods where it is quiet enough to perceive the life of small birds, or lost in the fog and deep tides of Cobscook Bay. Wherever you are in this entanglement of life and death, wondering if you've been a sluggard all year, pondering why your life isn't like a movie where George Clooney, with gray hair that always looks good, figures it all out. You can feel the weight of every day on your plate and want the water to swallow it with everything else that hasn't gone right. Want to feel something uplifting as you toss out your bread into this transmissivity of today where light and dark meet and the water finds its way. I think we're getting close to me stopping. Is that good?
5 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I talked about grief before, and I got to experience grief again when my brother was killed on September 11th in the World Trade Center. So it's like a very public kind of grief that goes along with the personal grief. You become a kind of standard bearer of, I was just, the grief was so intense, I was aware that there's the grief has a life of its own. So if you think, I'm over it, good to think that for now, and then, but maybe you aren't, or maybe you think I'm never going to get out of it the next time. Maybe you want to do something that's going to make you feel alive. So it's working inside you and outside you, and it just became so clear to me, and with that, and it's called Grief Arrives in Its Own Time. Grief arrives in its own time. It doesn't announce itself or knock on the door of your heart. Suddenly, it's right behind you, looking with great pity at the back of your neck and your shoulders on which it spends days placing a burden and lifting it. Grief arrives in its own sweet time, sweet because it lets you know that you are alive. Time because what you are holding becomes the only day there is. The sun stops moving, the sky grows utterly quiet and impossibly blue. Behind the blue are the stars we can't see, and beyond the stars, either dark or light, both of which are endless. So I think I'll read you two more poems. One is called Litany. No, I'm going to read you things that I don't usually read. Why not? So one poem I read, I hadn't read in a long time, but I was getting ready for this reading, and I thought, wow, so I'll read that. It's called Wild God. Because I've been studying, going to a Torah study group at Bethel for 2 years or so, and sometimes we puzzle over God's actions, and sometimes we say maybe that God is growing up with humans, like God's learning too, like the God of Genesis is not the same God of Exodus. So this is called Wild God. There was a time when God ran wild through the garden, when the earth was new and the animals hadn't been named yet. God ran wild like the wind through the trees. The crows were calling out to all the other creatures in their dark voices, "Wild God on the way, watch out." For in the right frame of mind, God could make the land tremble, make the mountains low, and the valleys rise up. Meanwhile, the grass kept growing, the soft grass of the pastures growing long enough to wave in the light. God liked being wild for a while, just lying back and seeing the future in the clouds and marveling at this work of the holy hands. Even wild God settle down and rest every now and then and begin to imagine making a place where someone will fear no evil, imagine goodness and mercy unleashed in the world. But then it's time to get up and run again, God being young and all. Run wild in a thunderous world, one big footstep at a time. There are days to make animals, and there are days to talk with the angels, days to wander among your children and in each one recognize a certain resemblance, days to go home and weep and think how hard it is not to create, but to handle the extended maintenance of the whole enterprise, not the beginning and the end, which will probably be simple, but the middle, the long middle when the plan is not so clear, the past making the present the future, like it's some conveyor belt of the cosmos. God isn't bone tired yet, but getting a little tuckered out with trying to get it right, just right, with every line in place, with every word the right one, just the way any artist would want to make it, one wild world at a time, one wild God running the show. And this last poem is another one I think that really speaks to Tikkun Olam. Generally, it's a bad practice to introduce a poem and then not have it. So watch this. I'm going to disappear for a second. Come back with a book. And this poem is called Holding the Light. Gather up whatever is glittering in the gutter, whatever has tumbled in the waves or fallen in flames out of the sky. For it's not only our hearts that are broken, but the heart of the world as well. Stitch it back together. Make a place where the day speaks to the night and the earth speaks to the sky. Whether we created God or God created us, it all comes down to this. In our imperfect world, we are meant to repair and stitch together what beauty there is. Stitch it with compassion and wire. See how everything we have made gathers the light inside itself and overflows. A blessing. Thank you. So I guess we have time for some questions, or if there are any in there.
Yeah, a few minutes for some questions. Starting with anything from folks in the room. Yeah, Rabbi.
You mentioned in passing a quote from a meditation manual from Laureate Kaplan, the great writer, a mystic. Is that meditation part of your practice? And I mean, for instance, he has exercises you visualize words and stuff. Is that part of, and is that something that you incorporate into your writing sort of like practically as well as theoretically?
I think with the writing, to me, it feels like a meditative form when I'll, there are a few things that I do, like I will write on a certain piece of paper, a certain size, and I take a micron, like a fine point pen, and I make letters with dots. So it actually slows me down, and I just start, and it has to end at that last corner of the page. So I'm actually in a state where I'm focusing on actually making letters, and I sometimes will do, like, you know, that in the Torah or in the old newspapers when they used to justify text, how like a letter would stretch out. I wind up stretching that out too. So it gives me I feel like I go to a kind of a deeper place when I do that. So I guess I do, yeah. Yeah.
This one's less of a comment, less of a question. But when you spoke about how you'd never seen a rainbow and thought of it as an oil rainbow, I like how you did, when you started your poem, you didn't talk about the oil actually. You spoke about the rain.
Mm-hmm.
And how that's not necessarily rain and sunlight coming together to make a rainbow, but it's still two very separate things coming together to make some sort of promise.
Yeah. And I think when I wrote that poem, actually in all the poems, I don't know exactly where it's going to go. I know I can get started, but I don't know, like the Mickey Mantle poem, I knew that event had happened, that I had the magical, mystical powers that helped Mickey Mantle get one of his 535 home runs that was due to me. But he may not, I don't know if he hit that many, but I didn't know when I was little, I didn't think about why did that happen. It was me reflecting back, I thought, began to think about suffering and prayer. So, like a memory is always where you are now. Yeah. Do we have any questions from the internet?
Yeah, questions from the rest of us. The first of which is really more of a comment.
Yeah.
But I'm gonna repeat it because I think Todd Miller is correct here. You are a blessing, Stu. Thank you.
Oh.
So that maybe would have been better at the end of things. But there's a question here from Noah. Do you think that your writing is influenced specifically by Jewish mysticism?
I think that part of it is I really liked reading Hasidic tales, like the ones, like there's a story about the treasure that you might know of. It's a children's book that Yuri Shulevitz illustrated to. It's a man named Isaac who says he has a dream to go to a place and dig for a treasure, and the dream never leaves him. He goes there, he gets to it's a palace, and there's a guard there, and he says, what are you doing here all the time? He said, well, I had a dream I should come and find a treasure here. And he came from far away, and the guard says, what a pity you wore your shoes out for a dream. If I believed a dream I had, I'd go to the house of a man named Isaac, that's the guy's name, and I'd dig under the hearth, and there I'd find a treasure. And Isaac goes home, and digs, and he finds the treasure right where he lived, which is a way of saying it's not somewhere else, it's where you are. And I love the openness of that, and Isaac Bashevis Singer, the things that were just like, it was a Jewish world that I didn't know about growing up, where it was very, the synagogue I went to was, this is how you do it. And it was an ancient tradition, but a 50s, 60s sensibility. It wasn't like, here's a mystical tradition. It's like, whoa, we have a mystical tradition. I didn't know that. I wish somebody had told me. So then I felt like, well, I could pursue that, and I could be moved by that. So yeah, definitely.
Great. Mary Ann asks, what is your process for editing your work? And as a writer, albeit in a very different vein, I would love to know this too.
Well, I think for me in the creating of it, I can't edit. You can't write and edit at the same time. You really have to, in my mind, whatever it is, you have to get out and go as deep as you can to where you want to go. And then you can say, well, you went too far on that, or you don't need that here, but you need to get it all out. And then you have to look at it as if you're somebody else, I think. Not be in love with like, well, I wrote that so great. But, maybe it's great for me, but when I read it to you, you have to think it has to move along a certain way. So I have to, I think, well, that was such a great thing that I thought, but it may not fit for that particular work. Sometimes I think of it like I play music as an amateur, and sometimes we'll play with a lot of people, and I think, like, what can I add to this that'll make it better? Like, do I need to add anything at this moment, or should I play or not play? Sometimes not playing is a choice, and I think editing is a way of thinking that way. Like what can I contribute? Not just show what I can do, but what can I contribute within how this piece is what it is right now? What does it need? So it's almost like doing that, but I have a hard time editing. Yes?
I thought I'd just follow up on that. At one point, you sort of mentioned, I thought you mentioned a little bit about how the poem is, based perhaps in your life or in your observation, but then it goes beyond. And I've had that tension where I'm writing something and it's really based in my experience, but then I want to tell a bigger story. And so there are places where it departs from truth, perhaps, or some form of truth, but perhaps a bigger truth. Could you comment a little bit on how that figures into your work?
Yeah, I mean, when I first started writing back in elementary school, or even through college, I would wait, like, there had to be a moment when the thing happened and I'd say, oh, this thing happened, I should write about it. And then I thought, well, you can actually start anywhere and go anywhere. It's not like I could write about driving in a snowstorm, or I might actually be writing something and remember what it's like to have a whiteout. And maybe I'll take that bit of whiteout and put it in to something about a dream at night, or, it's all within me to be able to use it. But I think the thing of, like, it really happened that way doesn't really matter so much, because it happened that way and how you remember it from the time you think it happened. But I think it's all very permeable. And I think to go to a place, I think the hard part is to go to a place of not knowing, but that's the only place to go to. It's like, well, it's like somebody who tells you the same joke and they think it's funny, but it's actually not, unless they actually discover something funny in the joke when they're telling it every time, then it's okay. But it's just like, well, here's a set piece about when I said a prayer for Mickey Mantle. That's like not the same as saying, if it worked, well, what happened to this kid when he thought about that, where did it go? So I think it's trying to be renewed in a way.
Maybe time for a few more questions?
Sure, yeah.
You're up for it?
I'm good.
Yeah, okay. All right.
I'll be so wired after this, I'll just drive home. It's really great.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's better than coffee, right? Yeah.
And all the Dunkin' Donuts will be closed by the time I leave.
It could be.
Yeah.
Joe asks, do you integrate Judaism into your poetry differently when you experience the landscape of Maine?
I don't know. Say that one again. Do I integrate?
Yeah, do you integrate Judaism into your poetry differently when you experience the landscape of Maine?
I don't. I mean, I think I may have it, and who I am is in the behind is with me when I'm writing. So it would definitely be like when I wrote the poem about my father, which is not about a landscape, but when I was trying to, I could see him leaving, and then the first image that came to me was this image of blessing the candles, but it wasn't like because it was a frame of reference I had. I mean, it was if I were Christian, then some other image would have come in my head. It was trying to understand the departure and the letting go and the blessing. So I think probably I see the landscape in the same way. And I really did see the guy across the street too in Deer Isle that time. But I called my wife, Susan, and she was in Portland at the time. I said, I think I just had a vision, which is not like me. And I think I know he was real. But there he is right now. Another one?
Yeah, I'm just scrolling here. Yeah, Noah says, it's interesting that you referenced Hasidic tales. I sometimes experience your reading of your poetry as almost Migun, but with lyrics.
Uh-huh. Wow.
And there's actually been some folks that have seconded that perspective here in the chat as well. And Marianne asks, are there any word or words that you won't use in a poem?
I don't think I'm that good with curse words. I mean, I am good with curse words. Say I'm driving, I'm really good with them. But not in a poem. I feel like it would be like it would almost call more attention to itself than the work, unless it was. I guess I would say whatever word you're using has to be in there for a good reason. Might be the best way to think of it.
Mm.
Like if it needs to be there, then it's there. If it doesn't need to be, there isn't there. But I would say there's not a word. There's certain like jargon, like bureaucratic speaking that I probably would shy away from because it doesn't really get at like the heart of the thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Laurie.
When did you first think of yourself as a poet? And when did you come out about that?
Well, it's funny. I remember when I was in elementary school, I was driving down the Garden State Parkway with my parents in a Buick Electra, and we were going by Perth Amboy, where Dutch Boy Paints is, and it really stunk. And I said, "Oh, the air smells like Vaseline." And my father, I was in the back seat, nobody had seatbelts on. It was that era. And my dad said, "Oh, you should write that down. That's what poets do. They write things down." Now, I didn't at that point say, "Oh, well, I guess that's what I'll do." Like if he had said, "You should be a chemist and find out why that is," if I would have become a chemist. But I just remembered that he had said that, and I wrote in probably junior high school, I began to. But I feel like I kind of struggled with that until I got out of college and I began to write in a way that I felt like the person who I am speaking to you could be the person writing the poems. I didn't have to become another person. I could be more myself to write the poems. That's when I started to feel like if they work, I found that combination.
Yeah.
I mean, I won't feel that way after I say that to you, but sometimes I can.
Anything else in the room here with us? No? Okay, I think with that,
So Facebook people, sorry you can't eat with us. We've got like, you won't believe what's behind
yeah,
the audience.
it's impressive. I might just spin the camera around real
Yeah.
quick to, well, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't. But thank you, Stuart Kestenbaum, for a lovely evening. Folks on Zoom, thanks for joining us. Thanks for bearing with technical difficulties around audio and such. And yeah, stay tuned for other events like this from Judaic Studies at U Maine.
Thank you. Now we're all going to eat. We can all take our masks off if you want.